Welcome everyone for the Sutta Sunday sharing and Dhamma sharing by Professor Premasiri. Before we start, please turn off your mic when the talk starts. Turn on the video so that the professor can connect with you. During the Q&A session, please use your raise hand function. If you have a question to ask, the host, which is me, Julian, will call on you to unmute your mic. Okay, let's move on. Before we start, let's pay homage to the Buddha. Please place your hand together. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Before we begin, we shall invoke the BDMS invocation. Reverence for the Buddha's words and attentiveness of mind will strive to know the Dhamma thoroughly. With diligence and care so that we can attain what the Buddha attained, we'll strive to practice the Dhamma fully. With love in our hearts, and because truth is the greatest gift, we will share the Dhamma generously with others. A little introduction before we begin. Professor Premasiri is a Professor Emeritus in Pali and Buddhist Studies at the University of Peradeniya. He is also an outstanding luminary who synthesized Buddhist and Western philosophical traditions. During his illustrious career in the university, he taught many Buddhist monks. His student monks are now serving all around the world. Currently, he is the president of the famous Buddhist Publication Society, which publicizes and translation of the Pali canon and academic works on Theravada Buddhism. Okay, Brother Manheng, please share your slides.
Okay. So, very welcome to this session on dependent arising, Paticcasamuppada, which I have described as the central teaching of the Buddha. So I will be trying to explain why it needs to be considered as the central Buddhist teaching. So that is why I have given this title to this slide, the centrality of the concept of dependent arising or Paticcasamuppada in Buddhism. The concept plays a central role in Buddhist philosophy or in the Buddhist doctrine, the teaching. Well, it has a philosophical character as well. It is not just a religious system which has to be accepted purely on faith. It is not a kind of revelation by some unseen superior being, but it is a kind of discovery by a human being who went in search of the truth and reality of this world, our existence. So the Buddha, when he claimed to have attained enlightenment or awakening of some sort, he described his awakening experience or enlightenment experience as a vision into the dependent and conditioned nature of things. Now I will explain the significance of this understanding, this awakening. Actually, the Buddha did not show much interest in explaining every phenomenon connected with our experience. he actually focused attention on one major issue. That was his concern. So he, at times, as we observe in the snake simile discourse, he points out that both in the past and right now, he says, I teach only two things. That is, the problem of what I may call dis-ease, dukkha. That is one way of putting it into English. The kind of stressful feeling, the kind of unsatisfactoriness that we experience in our lives, the unfulfilled mind that we experience almost every moment in our life. So the Buddha says, I speak only about this and the cessation of this. Dukkhang chahang panyapemi dukkhasya cha nirodha. What I lay down or what I teach you is about this kind of unsatisfactory living, unsatisfactory experience in human living, and how to put an end to it. So it is not necessary to understand this idea of putting an end to it as a kind of once and for all task. It could be done gradually. That means we could, in our day-to-day life, proportionately reduce or step by step reduce the kind of unsatisfactory experience that we usually have in our life. And for that purpose, we have to actually find out the actual causes for this unsatisfactoriness. Because this is a psychological issue. It pertains to our mental life. So in the mental life, what can we do as human beings who have the capacity to engage in reflective thinking? What can we do to deal with this situation? So actually, Paticcasamuppada is really dealing with that aspect of our life. Now, we find in the tradition that Sariputta, who became one of the two chief disciples of the Buddha, prior to his entry into the Buddhist order, requested the monk Assaji, who he met casually as he went along with his colleagues under the kind of discipline that he was following at that time. He was a wandering recluse who was going from place to place, a follower of a different teacher, but he was so attracted by the kind of appearance and the deportment of Venerable Assaji, who he saw on his way. And Assaji was one of the first converts to the Buddha's way. And Sariputta wishes to know the teacher that Assaji followed, because he was so attracted by Assaji's appearance, his pleasant ways, his calm deportment, and he wants to know, Sariputta wanted to know the kind of teacher that Assaji followed. Assaji, in response, presented the doctrine of causality as his response. He said, I am not really familiar with the details of the teaching, but I could give a kind of essence in terms of this notion. The essence of the Buddha's teaching is that he teaches about things that have come to be dependent upon conditions. That is what he teaches. Now, before we proceed further, I would like to say a few things from a kind of philosophical perspective about the existing varieties of causal theory. We can consider the Buddhist causal theory as one among several varieties that exist in philosophical or among philosophical circles. In the history of philosophy, both in the Indian and Western contexts, causal theories have been known. Three main philosophical theories of causation, definitive of the nature of what is referred to as a causal connection, have been proposed. Actually, the theistic religious traditions also talk about the significance of causation, and they are looking for a kind of first cause that could explain our existence. So their thinking is also a kind of causal thinking. But the problem is that their causal thinking actually is concerned mainly with speculation. It's a speculative kind of causal thinking, not based on observation and experience. That is the main difference between the Buddhist concept of causation and other existing theories of causation. So, in theological speculations, for instance, they speculatively introduce the Creator God as the first cause of things. And they actually give a definition of God, which actually is not a definition which is based on observation, but purely a speculative definition. That is, God is nothing greater than which can be conceived. So they try to derive the existence of God from purely a conception of God. So they say that God is nothing greater than which can be conceived, and say that therefore God must exist. He must exist, because if you conceive of a God who does not exist, it is possible for you to conceive a God who exists. So they say that God must therefore necessarily exist. So they try to derive the existence, the truth about the existence of God on the basis of pure thought or speculation. Now, here we see a very important difference between Buddhism and such systems of thought. Now, regarding causality, the theory favored by empiricist traditions is called the regularity theory of causation. And one of the well-known exponents of that theory was the British empiricist philosopher David Hume. And it is very likely that Hume had some understanding of the Buddhist tradition due to his contact with the Chinese Buddhist sources. It is, there is some evidence to that effect, that he had some contact with these Eastern philosophical traditions. And probably due to that influence, he rejected the traditional Western notions of causality, which had come down from a very ancient period. Actually, it could be even traced back to the times of Plato and Aristotle, these early Western theorists. So, the regularity theory is the one which is closest to a theory based on observation and experience. The second theory is favored by rationalist philosophers, and it is called the entailment theory of causation. Entailment theory. They think that causality is such a connection that from the concept of cause, we should be able to logically derive the effect. And in this process, they say that it is important to think about our existence as an effect. And if we take our existence as an effect, we could apply logical thinking and then derive the cause from the effect. From the effect, we can derive the cause by engaging in logical thinking. So that was what the rationalist philosophers have attempted to do. Then the third one is called the activity theory of causation. Activity theory of causation is the theory that says that cause is like a force, a kind of active agency. And it is, the cause has the capacity to produce an effect, and it is due to the recognition of that very capacity that we consider something as the cause, the causal active force that is inherent in the cause. That is what we ought to recognize. An examination of these philosophical theories shows that the one that is most compatible with that of canonical Buddhism, could we go up a little? Canonical Buddhism is the regularity theory. The regularity theory of causation. Now let me explain some of the logical characteristics or the formal characteristics of the known theories. According to the regularity theory of causation, it is sufficient to consider A, whatever you may symbolize under A, whatever thing or activity or happening that you isolate from your experience, and symbolized as A as the cause of B, another thing that you consider as coming within your conceptual order. So, according to the regularity theory of causation, it is sufficient to consider A as the cause of B if it is regularly found in our experience that A is followed by B. That is, whenever we find something, some activity or some existence that we identify as A, we regularly find that another thing or another activity that we identify as B follows it. So, according to the regularity theory, it is not necessary to consider the connection between A and B as a logically necessary connection. It is not a logically necessary connection. Now, what we mean by this idea, logically necessary, is that now, supposing we talk about father. Now, father is a concept. Father. So it is not logically necessary that if someone is a father, that person must be a male. So that is a logical deduction. The connection between a father and a male is a logical connection. But if you take something like, say, dengue fever, and the dengue mosquito. So the mosquito and fever, you can't just derive logically from the mosquito that it produces fever. It has to be observed in your experience that this kind of insect, if it bites, then you can be subjected to fever. And it is by collecting data over a long period of time that you establish these connections. So observed connections, empirically observed connections, are very different from logically derived conclusions. We logically derive conclusions. Say, if X is a father, then he is a male. But you can't logically derive that if X is a person who has a lot of craving, he is going to suffer the consequence of that craving. That is something to be established by observation and experience. We have to very closely experience our life process in order to understand that. We have to make observations. So that is what we have to consider to be most significant in the Buddhist doctrine of causation. So the entailment theory of causation, according to which we can derive the cause from the effect or the effect from the cause logically, is not acceptable to Buddhism. We have to make empirical observations in order to find what are the causes and what are the effects. Then, according to the activity theory of causation, A is the cause of B in the sense that A has within itself an active power to bring about B. Now the Buddha says, you can't observe any active power. Actually, there is no kind of consciousness or some determination on the part of the cause that as a cause, I must bring about this effect. There is no such agency hidden within the cause, an active agency hidden within the cause. It is just a fact that when there is something of a certain type, another thing of a certain other type is regularly connected with it. There is only a regular connection. That is what Buddhism emphasizes. And in terms of the logical characteristics of the Buddhist theory, it fits in very closely with the regularity theory of causation, which has appeared among the philosophers who were basing their theories on observation and experience. Okay. Next slide. Yes. The response to the entailment theory, according to the Buddha, what is derived by means of reasoning may or may not be in accordance with reality. Now, this is a very important observation that the Buddha makes, because sometimes we may engage in speculative thought and derive from our speculation various ideas that we might consider to be true. But when we examine what is really happening in the actual world, we may find that what we have derived through speculation does not work. So the Buddha very clearly states in certain instances that sometimes you may speculate in a very clever manner without any flaws in your logic. The use of your speculative activity. You may do it very accurately, but yet the result, what you derive from that speculation may not be fitting with the observed facts. So the Buddha says, tatapi hoti anyatapi hoti. It may sometimes be as you have speculatively derived, but there may be occasions on which it does not fit in with the reality of the situation. So that is the reason why Buddhism does not agree with an entailment theory of causation. Buddhism maintains that the causal order of phenomena related to human misery has been observed and experienced by the Buddha, but not derived by means of rational thought. It is therefore considered as not belonging to the sphere of pure speculation or logic. So when the Buddha attained enlightenment, he said his enlightenment experience consisted of awakening into paticca samuppada. That was what he realized. Ida paccayata paticca samuppada. And he maintained that it is his enlightenment experience. Paticcasamuppada was his enlightenment experience. The activity theory of causation is also rejected by the Buddha in maintaining that it is not necessary to conceive of some kind of power analogous to will or volition that resides in the cause, giving rise to the effect. Causality needs to be seen without positing any agency or active power that underlies the causes or conditions. This idea came to be developed also in later Theravada doctrine. I think the Theravada doctrine developed by Venerable Buddhaghosa, the commentator, was aware of this issue in his commentarial descriptions of Paticcasamuppada. So Buddhaghosa rejected the notion of any attribution of agents to the causal process, maintaining that there is no maker of the cyclic process of existence. He said, there is no karaka, a creator, a doer of the cyclic process of existence. Sansara sakaraka. But it is just the flow of pure dhammas dependent on the collocation of causes, the coming together of causes and conditions that can be observed. So he puts it as Suddha Dhamma Avattanti, pure processes, pure natural processes roll on, hetu sambhara pacca, dependent on the collocation of causes or conditions. Okay. The Buddhist concept of dependent arising, as described in the canonical sources, shows that it is compatible to a great extent, as I said before, with a definition in terms of regular connection. Many instances are found in the canonical sources where the Buddha first introduces the formal structure, the formal structure of what could be understood as a causal connection, and the application of it to discover in our observed experience the phenomena so connected. So we can speak of a formal structure of Paticcasamuppada as well as its practical applications. We could recognize the Paticcasamuppada doctrine in those terms. In terms of a formal structure that is given and that is also based on observation, not speculation, as well as the application of that formal structure to explain various events, various phenomena that we come across in our day-to-day experience. Due to the reason that the Buddha was concerned primarily with the causation of human misery or dis-ease, what we call suffering, although it's not the most appropriate word to use, I would say dis-ease, unsatisfactoriness. His application of the principle was directed towards the identification of observable processes in that sphere of reality. Okay. Now I would like to point out the formal aspect of dependent arising. What is its form? The structure or the form. In the Buddhist canonical sources, the Buddha points out that there are instances in which the observable reality conforms to the following form. Now, what I am trying to present here is the way in which the formal features of Paticcasamuppada, the formal feature of Paticcasamuppada is presented in the Buddhist teaching. When something of a certain kind exists, something of another kind is also found to exist. That is what is conveyed by this formulation, asmin sati idang hoti. That is, when something of a certain kind exists, something of another kind also is found to exist. That is the regular connection. When something of that kind arises, so it may be the case that something did not exist before, that we observe that it is now arising. So when something of that kind arises, something of that other kind also is found to arise. Because we find sometimes new things coming up that we hadn't had experience before. New events, new happenings can occur. And there also we can observe a regular connection. When something of that kind arises, something of that other kind also is found to arise. Imassa uppada idang uppajjati. Now, there may be a situation in which you don't find any dengue mosquitoes around. But suddenly, for some reason, they begin to breed in a certain area. Then you find this sickness arising. So when something of that kind arises, something of that other kind also is found to arise. Imassa uppada idang uppajjati. Then on the other hand, when something of that kind does not exist, the thing of the other kind is found not to exist. So when a thing of the kind A is absent, a thing of the kind B is also absent. Asmin asati idang hoti. Then, having been in existence, something can disappear, cease to exist. That is what is expressed by the fourth, the last one. When something of that kind ceases, the thing of the other kind is also found to cease. Imassa nirodha idang nirujjati. Now, all these connections are to be established on the basis of observation, not speculative. We have to observe these relationships between things of kind A and things of kind B. Yes, can we move on? So, if the relation between two observed phenomena, A and B, conforms to the above form, it is to be taken as a causal relationship. It becomes clear that according to this description, the cause of something is to be known by means of observation and experience. It is not possible to infer logically from the concept of the thing alone its cause or effect. So that is where Buddhism differs from most speculative systems of thought. There is no attempt to derive causes from the notion of an effect. Okay. Now I shall go into some clarifications about the Buddhist concept. There are certain clarifications to be made in order to show the distinctive character of the Buddhist concept of dependent arising. Buddhism does not view the causal connection in the form of a linear sequence, suggesting to the intellect the notion of an original cause. Now, if you take causation to be a kind of linear sequence, now there is a tendency for us to be misled by considering the 12-fold standard formulation of the doctrine. In the 12-fold standard formulation of the doctrine, there is an attempt to present a certain sequence of the causal nexus, with ignorance as the first factor. Avijja, Sankara, Vijnana, Nama Rupa, Salayatana, and so forth. The 12 links that we are familiar with. Now, we should not be misled into thinking that dependent arising has to be understood as a linear process in which the first link can be conceived as an uncaused first cause. Actually, the Buddha was very much opposed to the notion of an uncaused first cause. The reason was that he didn't want to affirm anything that he was not able to observe directly in his experience. Now, we are familiar with the Buddha's reference to the cycle of existence. Actually, he taught about a cyclic process of experience as he claimed on the basis of what he observed. So he maintained that he actually had direct knowledge and experience of this cyclic process in his own being. He said that this cyclic process is without a known beginning. Well, he didn't commit himself to the idea that there is no beginning. He only said that the beginning is something that he could himself not know. Anamataggo. Anamataggo means without a known beginning. Anamataggo ayang sansaro. This cyclic process is without a known beginning. Pubbha koti na panyayati. Na panyayati means it is not evident. It is not seen. So he left it at that without committing himself to any speculative notion about the arising of this cyclic process. So as a result, Buddhism does not view the causal connection in the form of a linear sequence, suggesting to the intellect the notion of an original cause. Buddhism clearly maintains that the search for an uncaused first cause, which is called akaranang mulakaranang. Akaranang means it has no cause. Mulakaranang means the root cause. A root cause that has no cause for itself is a consequence of a mistaken idea of the nature of the causal relationship. It is only if you conceive the causal relationship accepted in Buddhism as a linear process with a starting point and an ending point, a beginning and an end, then you would speculate on the first cause. But from the Buddhist perspective, the idea of a first cause itself is unwarranted. It has no basis. Buddhism does not view the causal relationship as merely a one-to-one relationship due to the recognition of a plurality of conditions. That is also an important point to consider. According to the Buddha, causal relationships are not just one-to-one relationships. They are actually representing a plurality of conditions in any causal situation. It is not just a one-to-one relationship, but a situation in which there is a plurality of conditions. Yes, shall we move on? This idea is presented clearly in the early canonical sources, where the causal relationship is explained on the analogy of certain observable biological processes of the world. So Buddhism sometimes tries to explain the phenomenon of causality or dependent arising, pointing to certain observable processes of the natural, physical, or the biological world. So you could apply the same methodology to come to conclusions or to come to judgments about the inner experiential process. So when the Buddha talked about this problem of dukkha or unsatisfactoriness, he was talking about the inner kind of experience. But from an analogical point of view, it is possible to observe such dependent arising in the biological world, in the physical world, the material world. When the question was raised regarding the existence of what people usually consider to be the self, it is pointed out that it is not produced by itself, or it is not something outside itself. It is not produced by itself, nor is it produced by something outside itself. Naidang attakatang, that is, it's not produced by itself. Naidang parakatang, it is not produced by something other than itself. But it is a product of causes, in the way when we sow a certain seed, it sprouts. Now, this is an example from the biological world. When we sow a seed, it sprouts, depending upon the nutrition provided by the soil and other conditions such as moisture, the fertility of the soil, the nutrition. So all these conditions have to come together for some occurrence to occur, for something to happen, for something to come into existence. Several conditions have to come together. So what Paticca Samuppada deals with is this coming together of conditions. And I think if you go into an etymological analysis of the term Paticca Samuppada, it is evident that these aspects are clearly found in such an analysis. Actually, the Buddha did not find any term existing at that time in order to convey his enlightenment experience, his awakening experience. There were all kinds of notions existing at the time, but they were incapable of conveying his awakening into reality. That is why a new term had to be coined. The term Paticca Samuppada happens to be a totally innovative term which was introduced into Indian philosophical language. That is also a very important point to consider. So it has several components. It's not a simplistic term like the existing philosophical terms in the Indian philosophical background. There were theories like self-made, other-made, both self-made and other-made, or fortuitously arising. Now, these concepts were there, but the Buddha left aside all of them. And for all these questions, whether life is something that is made by itself, or whether it is made by something other than itself, or by both, or whether it is something that arises without cause or condition, just by chance. The Buddha leaves aside all these notions, and as the alternative, he presents dependent arising. So can we move on to the next slide? So the Buddha, in response to a person named Kaccayana, this is a very well-known discourse of the Buddha appearing in the Samyutta Nikaya, volume 4, page 295, called the Kaccayana Gotta Sutta. He teaches that dependent arising is the explanation in the middle, avoiding the two extremes of external being and absolute, of eternal being and absolute annihilation. Those were the two extreme views that were present at the time as explanations of the nature of reality. They accepted either a kind of eternal being, or they accepted absolute annihilation. So the notion of eternal being was accepted by the traditional Vedic system of thought, according to which our final deliverance consists of merging with the absolute reality, which is Brahman. So we have eternal life. Now, Buddhism does not talk about eternal life. Buddhism only talks about eternal deliverance, a kind of peace that we attain here and now, and the non-continuity of the kind of unsatisfactory process of living. So the Nidana Samyutta of the Samyutta Nikaya mentions of 4 philosophical positions that the Buddha rejected in his discussion of the causal arising of suffering. They are presented as the theory of self-causation, that is to say, sayang katang dukkham. This unsatisfactory state is self-created. Then the theory of other causation, that is parang katang dukkha. It is created by or made by something other than the self. Then the combination of these two, sayang katangcha, parang katangcha. So two false theories, when put together, would not make an acceptable theory. So the Buddha rejects all 3 of them. And the final explanation given by some schools of thought was the theory of neither self nor other causation, which affirms that things arise just by chance, fortuitously, which is called adicca samuppanna. No explanation can be given. They just arise by chance. There is fortuitous arising of things. The Buddha very clearly left aside all these 4 forms of explanation given. So Paticca Samuppada was given as the Buddhist alternative to the above theories of arising. And Buddhism considered all of them as distortions of reality. Okay, we can move on to the next one. In the Kacchanagotta Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha points out that there are two extreme views, one or the other of which is widely held by people. So people cannot, in their way of thinking, escape these two viewpoints. They fall into one or the other of these extremes. Now, when we talk about the Buddha's teaching, I think we have to consider the concept of the middle way of the Buddha as having two components. One is the theoretical middle way, or the doctrinal middle way. The Buddha actually conceived of a doctrinal middle way. And this doctrinal middle way has its implications on the practical middle way. Now, we are very familiar with this practical middle way, which speaks about right view, right thoughts, right aspirations, and so forth, the Noble Eightfold Path. That is the practical middle way. The theoretical middle way, or the doctrinal middle way, is going in the middle, or taking the middle path with respect to these two extreme doctrinal positions. One doctrinal position is that everything is sabbang atti. Here, the attempt is to reduce everything in existence to some absolute essence. So those who affirm this viewpoint deny that there is reality to our day-to-day objects of experience. They have no reality. Our individual's existence, what we observe around us, the mountains, trees, the clouds, the sky, and so forth, they have no essential reality. What has essential reality is the absolute essence called Brahman. They all are reducible to Brahman according to the Vedic system of thought. So we have found in metaphysical teachings that have appeared in the history of human thought, this kind of absolutism, the attempt to reduce everything to an absolute essence, an absolute beginning, from which things either appear as appearances, or from which things evolve in a process of evolution. Now, such theories of inference from an absolute essence, or evolution from an absolute original essence, are not acceptable to Buddhism. They are considered as speculative theories. That is why I think certain evolutionary theories that were presented by the Sankhya system of thought, for instance, was not acceptable to the Buddhist tradition. They were not in conformity with the Buddhist way of conceptualizing reality. So it is the materialist notion that is usually identified with the view that everything is annihilated after this life. So there is nothing that continues. So the materialist thinking actually believed in the non-continuity and the annihilation of our existence at death. So Buddhism takes the middle way. Buddhism did not affirm the notion of eternal being, nor did it affirm the notion of total destruction after the death of a being. Buddhism affirmed the idea of continuity, and this continuity was explained in terms of causes and conditions. So, two terms are familiar to the Buddhist tradition called Sassatavada. Sassatavada refers to the theory of eternal existence, that there is some essence which is eternal and which survives to eternity. And the Buddha considered that doctrine as totally foolish doctrine, an empty doctrine. In the Alagadupama Sutta, the Buddha points out that it is a totally empty doctrine. And the other one was the doctrine of nihilism, that everything is destroyed at death. Now, in the Alagadupama Sutta, the Buddha points out that because he did not talk about eternal existence or a survival unto eternity, he was identified by some teachers as teaching annihilation. And he says it is a false accusation, a misrepresentation of his teaching. He never taught the annihilation. He never taught about the annihilation of a really existing being. He says, I have never taught such a teaching. I have only taught both in the past and I am teaching in the present only the arising of suffering or dis-ease and the cessation of dis-ease. So the other doctrine he considers as sato sattassa uchchedang vinasang vibhavang panyapeti, which means those who lay down that a really existent being is destroyed, is made non-existent when someone follows the Buddha's path. That the Buddha says was not his goal, because he was not interested in the idea of a really existent self. He never taught about such a thing. So if he did not teach about a doctrine, he did not present a doctrine connected with a really existing self, how could one talk about the annihilation of such a self? The problem of, or the question of annihilation of a really existing self should arise only if one recognizes such a really existing self. So for the Buddha, it was not an issue to be taken into account. So Paticcasamuppada was proposed as the doctrine in the middle that represented the observed world as it really is. In terms of this middle position, Buddhism rejected both idealist and materialist doctrine. So actually, from a philosophical standpoint, Buddhism does not actually conform to any kind of idealism or to any kind of materialism. Okay, we can go to the next. Next slide, please. Can we move on? Yeah. Yeah, so the practical implications of the teaching. Humans possessed of the capacity to engage in reflective investigation are called upon to insightfully understand the common human predicament of unfulfilled living in causal terms and practically deal with it in order to seek the reduction or the total elimination of that condition. I think it's important from our lay standpoint, living as lay persons, this idea that understanding this causal connection or understanding causality should help us at least to reduce our suffering, to reduce our stressful living by taking into account the causal conditions. Then you recognize the causes, the conditions that give rise to agitation, that give rise to dejection, that give rise to psychological problems, then it is possible to deal with them. I think sometimes the simile is used that if we are watchful of thieves entering our premises, the thieves would not be able to enter our premises. So these unwholesome states of mind are like thieves. When we are not alert, they enter into our minds. So we should be alert in order to observe them and deal with them. So that is the importance of understanding the causal relationship. When we closely observe our inner nature, we can find out what kind of emotions lead to dejection, lead to frustration, lead to disappointment. And having identified them, we could find our own solutions to those issues. So this is what in the modern world, the psychotherapists who are identified as cognitive therapists are attempting to do. I believe that they have been influenced to a great extent by the Buddhist way of looking at our inner nature. The traditional Buddhist formulation of the 12 links of the cyclic process of causality, of causally arisen existence, having as its end product a mass of suffering, indicates the crucial links that can be removed in order to overcome the predicament. In this regard, the foremost priority is given to ignorance and craving. So these are the two crucial links. If we are able to deal either with ignorance or with craving, then it becomes possible for us to overcome the predicament. And ignorance and craving are closely tied together. So in order to get rid of these two, we have to actually see the mutual relationship between the two and deal with them, having observed that mutual relationship. So they have to be dealt with together, in combination. Okay, shall we move to the next? Now, I will come to the concluding remarks. Dependent arising is not a speculative metaphysical theory based on pure reason. That needs to be actually emphasized. It is not something presented in a way that speculative philosophers presented a theory about the nature of existence, a theory of reality. So it's really a kind of scheme, a very practical kind of observation that the Buddha makes, not based on speculation, but on observed experience. That is something that we need to emphasize. It is an empirically observable characteristic of existing things. So if anyone wants to see it, one can actually commit oneself to that kind of observation. So where the Buddha refers to Paticca Samuppada, he points out that it is not a theory that he has created out of speculation. It is something that exists in the nature of things, whether Buddhas are born into the world or not, whether Buddhas appear in the world or not, this reality continues to exist in the world. Uppadava tathagatanam, anuppadava tathagatanam. Under circumstances in which the Tathagatas are born into this world or not born into this world, dhitavasa dhatu, this element of reality, has stayed in the world. That is idapaccheta, this dependent arising of things that stays in the world as part of the reality of the world. So it can be considered as an empirically observable characteristic of existing things. That is why when the Buddha realized it, when he became awakened to it, he says, see, this is what is happening. Passathati aha. He says, look, this is what is happening. So a Tathagata discovers it, what is there in reality, and then he asks other people also to observe it. And without reflective observation, one cannot observe it, because we act, we respond to our empirical situation, our sensory situation, like machines. Our behavior is machine-like. Our activity is machine-like. Even our thinking is machine-like. It's mechanical. So we have to overcome this mechanistic process of existence and use our reflective understanding, which is called pajanana. Pajanati is to reflectively know. We have to reflectively know. That is panya. So we need panya to understand dependent arising. So the general principle is applicable to the solution of any practical problem affecting the humans. So if we are confronted with any practical problem, this is an effective way of dealing with the practical problem. However, the Buddha confined the application of the principle, the basic principle, primarily to the general human predicament of unfulfilled life experience. There are some instances in which he applied it to explain even social phenomena, like, for instance, the arising of conflict in society. There are also, he applied dependent arising because he was concerned with suffering or unsatisfactoriness that occurs at the social level, at the level of our social relationships. So in such situations, the Buddha applies the principle to explain social conflict, for instance, why people go to war, why people go into conflict. There are situations in which within the same family, between father and mother, between son and mother, father and son, there is conflict. Matapi puttena vivadati, pitarapi puttena vivadati. So this is some reality that we observe, all kinds of conflicts, and they are explainable in terms of paticca samuppada. So all manner of conflict that occurs even at the social level could be explained by applying the principle of paticca samuppada or dependent arising. So dependent arising serves as the central doctrine of Buddhism, in terms of which all other Buddhist teachings become meaningful. So that explains why Assaji presented dependent arising as the essence of the Buddha's teaching. Okay. So this is what I have to say regarding the subject, and we could spend a little time, if you like, on answering a few questions, explanatory remarks on what I have said, and I hope I have tried to explain the issue as clearly as possible.
Thank you, Professor, for a very insightful talk. I'm sure there are many burning questions that the people would like to ask. The floor is open. Can you please raise your hands and then I will unmute you. Okay, everyone's quite shy. Why don't I just start the ball rolling? Professor,
Yeah.
concerning the causation theory, you have emphasized 3 causation theory. There's one on the activity theory of causation, where we talk about a cause for the for the effects.
Yeah.
Would
Cause as a kind of force. Yeah.
would craving, volitional craving, be considered under this category?
Yeah. Now, craving is a condition. Craving is a condition. And as I said, craving is also a condition that arises from other conditions. You wouldn't have craving unless you possess certain senses, like the eye, ear, nose, tongue, the body. And there is also, apart from this internal sense organism, there is an external world that interacts with the internal senses. So, in causal terms, the Buddha takes into account the existence of these internal senses, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, etc., and the external stimuli, the stimuli of the senses, material form, sounds, tastes, smells, and there is a mechanical process that takes place when there is interaction between the two. That is very well explained in contexts in which the Buddha talks about this mechanical process. And in order to overcome this mechanistic process that occurs, one has to cultivate what is called sati. Sati means alertness, being aware of the situation, being mindful, because otherwise we become victims to the mechanical process. There is just a situation in which there is a stimulus and there is a response. Just a stimulus response mechanism without some inner understanding of the situation and dealing with it. So it is by means of mindfulness that it becomes possible to deal with that situation. So the general formulation of Paticca Samuppada in terms of avidya, sankhara, that is ignorance, volitional acts, consciousness, that process is a mechanical one. If you don't do anything about it, then that process will go on. So if you want to change the situation, you have to get rid of avidya. And for that, you have to have insight. You have to cultivate mindfulness. So what is most important is not resigning ourselves to this determined process. There is a determined process, but if we resign ourselves to it, then it goes on like that. So there is a possibility of both entirely overcoming it or at least partially overcoming it. it may not be possible for most of us to overcome it totally within a short time. It may take a lot of training, a lot of application of effort in order to overcome it. So that is why Buddhism talks about the need to put forth effort. Virya aradha virya, putting forth effort. So you understand the situation and then try to change it.
Thank you, Professor. There is a question from the floor. It's in the chat group. Maybe I'll just read it out. It says, could you help to explain, in respect of the link between consciousness and nama rupa, if you could give some explanation on the following, the intricacies of the reciprocal conditionality between consciousness and nama rupa, and vice versa.
I believe that these two go on until the point of what we call deliverance, or the final appeasement, the connection between nama rupa and vijnana. Now, if not for this interconnection between nama rupa and vijnana, there wouldn't be a situation in which we get into this trap. So as long as this mutual connection between nama rupa and vijnana continues, we are trapped into this situation. So we have to find a way of breaking this connection. And that is why it is said that finally we have to achieve a point or attain a point at which vijnana does not get established. Vijnana does not get established. So in the ordinary situation, consciousness always tries to find a place for its establishment. And where it gets established is in a nama rupa. Nama rupa is a sensitive organism. A sensitive organism. So it always looks for a kind of sensitive organism for itself to ensure its continuity. And when this tendency of consciousness to establish itself somewhere is gone, then we cannot say what happens to vijnana, consciousness. So the Buddha says, you cannot talk about it. You cannot even speculate about it. And he only speaks about it in terms of vimutta citta. That person's mind is released. And where the consciousness gets established after that release of the mind is not possible to say. It is inconceivable.
So, Professor, we can just summarize it as consciousness ceases craving for establishment.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question.
It becomes an unestablished consciousness. apatittita viññāna. There is this idea of apatittita viññāna, a consciousness which has no existence or has no establishment. It does not stay somewhere.
The next question is on the hidden vortex. How the anusayas of the past life influences the characteristic tendency and disposition of the present life.
Yeah, actually, here I think Buddhism deals with 3 levels of experience. The 3 levels of experience consist of our day-to-day expression of bodily and verbal and sometimes even thoughts, thinking, bodily actions, verbal actions. They are actually the ongoing activity. The bodily and the verbal activity is observable by outsiders as well. And the thought activity may be observable if we look closely within ourselves to us. And sometimes we don't observe it because it occurs mechanically. It's just a mechanical process of which we are unconscious at times. There is a second level at which this occurs. That is, since we are possessed of the sense faculties, and there are stimuli that interact with the sense faculties, in this interactive situation, there are certain emotions that flare up, that suddenly arise. That is called pariyutthana. Pariyutthana means coming up from all sides. Total flaring up. Total flaring up. That is pariyutthana. And this happens because we have the dormant tendency underlying. The underlying tendency is there. That is why they flare up when an appropriate sensory situation is present. So these are the 3 levels. So Buddhism applies its causal principle to deal with these situations at 3 different levels by following 3 different kinds of practical training. So at the gross level of releasing these tensions within us by speech and action, we can exercise a certain degree of control and discipline by means of voluntarily taking up certain forms of training. That is called training of sila. The adoption of good precepts and practices in our day-to-day life. That gives us a certain discipline to reduce the tendencies. Otherwise, these tendencies become more pronounced and they sink into our character. And then they become anusaya. Actually, anusayas are those tendencies that have sunk into our nature for a long time. They have been accumulated for a long time. And when they have been accumulated, when certain appropriate circumstances arise, they spring up, they flare up, and our reactions happen according to those tendencies. So Buddhism lays down a threefold way in order to overcome this situation. First, the practice of voluntary restraints. We voluntarily take up certain forms of restraint through the observance of precepts, sila. Then this inner disturbance that occurs can also be dealt with by training the mind consciously and deliberately to calm down. And that is the purpose of what we call samadhi. So sila is for restraining the expression of certain unwholesome tendencies in our mind, and samadhi is to prevent the disturbance that arises due to, so we voluntarily cut off certain stimuli. So it is when the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, these senses are interacting with their respective stimuli that these unwholesome types of experience occur within us. Now, in samadhi, we don't let these things impinge upon our senses. We deal with the mind directly and try to focus attention not on diverse objects of the senses, but on some chosen object, some selected object. It may be the breath, it may be some patch of color, or whatever you like, for you to bring the mind together so that no occasion is given, no occasion is provided for the disturbances to flare up. And that gives some kind of temporary release of the mind. Temporary release of the mind. It is not based on intellectually or insightfully seeing the reality, but it is a kind of imposed discipline on the mind, which makes the mind calm and tranquil. So the third process is what we call the panya process. So sila, samadhi, panya. That is reflective understanding, reflective knowledge. For that, one needs what Buddhism calls the vipassana practice, the insightful observation of things. So when such insight is cultivated to the maximum degree, then one does not have to be absorbed in a kind of meditative, contemplative state in order to be free of these unsatisfactory states of mind, dejection, despair. It is not necessary to get into an artificially generated state of mind. But of course, we have to remember that the contemplative absorptions are very pleasant. They are described by the Buddha as Ditta Dhamma Sukha Vihara, which means dwellings that are happy dwellings comfortable dwellings in this very life. So if one wants to have that experience, maybe for a certain limited period of time, one can actually experience it. So in even one's daily life, one can spend a few hours or just a few minutes absorbed in that kind of contemplative absorption. The jhanas, they are called the jhanas. So that's a very pleasant experience, which is actually not recognized when people just think of the pleasures of the senses. The Buddha actually sees a hierarchy of experiences of happiness. And in this hierarchy of experiences of happy living, the Buddha considers the sensuous level as the lowest. Kama sukha, the happiness that we derive from sensuous experience, is, according to the Buddha, the lowest level. And he says, appasada kama bahudukha bahupayasa. The sensuous enjoyments give little delight, but they give a lot of suffering. And they involve a lot of making of effort, putting forth effort in order to retain them, but we end up being frustrated. So they are not actually there is no stability in them, very unstable. So if one wants a little more stability in the kind of pleasant experience that one can have, one can get into one of these contemplative states of mind and experience a much higher state of pleasant experience. So the Buddha gives the different levels of mind training and says that in the hierarchy, each higher level of contemplative experience has a higher quality of happiness. It offers a higher quality of pleasant experience. So the first jhana experience is much higher than the sensuous experience. The second jhana experience is much higher than the first jhana experience. Like that, he gives a hierarchy. And then in describing this hierarchy, he says, Nibbana Paramang Sukham. That is, the total appeasement that comes with Nibbana is the highest happiness.
So, Professor, based on what you said, the final release is actually coming from the wisdom faculty, which is the seeing things as they are, in that sense. Okay, because that was one of the questions, so I think that's answered. There's another question. Thus, dependent arising explains the 5 niyamas and natural laws, which includes physical and chemical matters, which may not be related to human beings.
Yeah. Actually, this was a formulation that came in the commentarial period, this idea of the 5 niyamas that was formulated mainly by commentators like Buddha Ghosa, but the basic idea can be traced to the canonical sources. Now, the Buddhist tradition recognizes that there are certain laws operating in the physical universe. Like, for instance, famines can occur under certain situations. There can be storms and fires, they are also due to causes and conditions. It is due to causes and conditions that these natural phenomena also take different forms of activity. So in the biological realm, as I explained earlier, we can look at the growth of a plant. If you take a plant, I think this is a Buddhist simile that has been used in order to explain what causal dependence is. A plant, in order to grow, has to depend on several conditions. That is, there has to be a seed. Then there has to be a fertile soil. There has to be moisture. And perhaps air around it, the suitable environment for the seed to sprout. So if you put a seed on a hard rock without any fertile nutrition, without any nutrition for it, it wouldn't grow. So similarly, in our life also, there is this requirement. And in the Buddhist tradition, this was conceived later in the systematized Abhidhamma tradition as a kind of investigation into the conditions, conditionality. So in later Buddhism, there were two notions of paticca samuppada. Buddhaghosa mentions about it, what is called the Dvadasanganaya. Dvadasanganaya is the 12-fold paticca samuppada method. And the Paccaya. Paccaya is the conditionality method, the 24 conditions. So in Theravada scholasticism, they identified 24 conditions on which the process of life depends. That was also applied only to explain human experience, the experience of humans, not just the physical world. But of course, the theory, as a theory, is applicable also to the physical world. If we need to understand any activity in the world, the best way to understand it is in terms of this principle, dependent arising. When what exists, does this phenomenon exist? When what does not exist, does this phenomenon not exist? So that is a method that can be applied even to explain physical phenomena, material phenomena. So that is what I think science has adopted in its investigation into reality for practical purposes. So in the ordinary practical life, also, we are actually making use of a similar principle, understanding of causal connections. But the Buddha was not interested in the mundane affairs, although in a limited sense, he talked about mundane relationships. What causes lead to the collapse of peace in society, political upheavals he sometimes dealt with in suttas like the Chakravarti Sihanada Sutta. Such instances are there, but generally he was concerned mainly with this reduction or the total elimination of unsatisfactoriness from our inner being.
There was a follow-up question. Is there any differences between the 12 casual links and the 24 pachayas?
Yeah, 24 pachayas. Yes, that is kind of later development from the point of view of Abhidhammic speculation. And I believe it is partly based on empirical observation and partly based on speculation. Abhidhamma makes use of both methods, rational speculation as well as observable experience, or what is experientially observable. Abhidhamma uses both methods, and there are also different systems of Abhidhamma, and in some systems of Abhidhamma there are other conditions that are recognized, not as in the Theravada system, 24 conditions. So actually it's in the Theravada tradition that we have this doctrine of 24 conditions. It is a very intellectual kind of exercise that the Theravadists had gone into. They actually developed a very complex network of causal relationships by introducing that analysis. And it requires a lot of intellectual effort even to understand it. It was a highly theoretical formulation of the dependent arising principle. But if we take a few examples, like for instance, we can see it as an attempt to identify different conditions and name them. Identify the variety of conditions that play a part in the cyclic process of existence and give them a name, group them. So there is a condition called the Indriya Pacha. Indriya Pacha. That is the condition which can be identified with the existence of the six senses. So the existence of the six sensitive, these internal senses that actually are sensitive to the stimuli is a condition. So there is an Indriya Pacha, the condition of internal sense. Then as another condition, there exists the external stimuli. So that is the Ayatana Pacha, the external stimuli condition. Like that, the Abhidhamma tried to identify the multiplicity or the plurality of conditions and name them. So they identified a condition called Kamma Pacha. Kamma, because Buddhism recognizes that even what has been accumulated as tendencies coming from the past that also plays a role in the immediate experience in our lives in the present. So that is the Kammapaccaya. So they identified numerous conditions and named them as Indriyapaccaya, Ayatanapaccaya, Kammapaccaya, Adhipatipaccaya. So certain conditions are very predominant. Therefore, they were called Adhipatipaccaya.
Professor, I think we can summarize by saying that the Buddha was interested in explaining suffering and the end of suffering. So whatever system that is developed has to have that aim in mind. If not, it becomes just an intellectual speculation.
Yes.
Okay, I think we have time. We don't have time anymore. I think this is probably the last question because we have run out of time.
How does one apply this knowledge? What is it?
How to apply DA in our daily lives and situation?
In the daily life. Yeah. Now, the daily life is a situation in which we are constantly being flooded, or we have to actually confront the floods that flow into ourselves, the emotional floods. So the Buddha compares them to floods because they are extremely unmanageable. They flow into us without ourselves being aware of them. So one person comes to the Buddha and questions him using the flood simile. He asks, Yani sotani lokasmin, king te sang nivaranam. In the world, there are these uncontrollable floods flowing in. How do we actually prevent them or obstruct them? The Buddha says, Yani sotani lokasmin sati te sang nivaranam. Whatever floods in this world may flow into you, what checks them, what checks those floods is mindfulness. If you are mindful about those influxes, then you can reduce their force. It is like a thief entering the house, and when the thief is recognized, he has no power. So the best thing is to cultivate what is called mindfulness, which is again not an easy thing to do. In practical terms, it requires a lot of training. And I think modern psychotherapists also emphasize this point, that if there is constant understanding, the cognition, inner cognition of what is happening, then it becomes possible to overcome a stressful situation. So, although it's a difficult thing for us to practice, the more one puts that into practice, the less is one's day-to-day suffering. So I don't think in the lay situation in which we find ourselves, we are able to completely overcome. But we can reduce. We can reduce if we employ the principles of Dhamma as far as it is possible within our limited circumstances.
Thank you, Professor. Let us dedicate the merits from the participating in this wholesome Dharma activity to our departed relatives and friends. Inam mena tinam hotu sukita hontu natayo. Idam mena tinam hotu sukita hontu natayo. Idam mena tinam hotu sukita hontu natayo. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. I shall now call on Sister Yendi to chant the closing chant. Sister Yendi.
No pumbangama dhamma mano seta mano maya manasace padutena pasati wa karoti wa tato nam dukaman weti cakam wato padang mano pumbangama dhamma mano seta mano maya manasace pasanena basati wa karoti wa tato nam sukaman weti caya wa anapaini tato nam sukaman weti caya wa anapaini tato nam sukaman weti caya wa anapaini.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. It has been a pleasure having Professor here. Professor, thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the session. It was
Thank
quite
you, Professor.
really. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye. Bye.